Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
Our next subject is incredibly serious. I must ask a question on Twitter, and I'll announce the results later on. Do you have an organ donor card? Have you one of those? Have you filled out one of those? Let me know if you have. Just to do a quick poll of our listeners, I'd like to know that. Because there's a lot we don't know about organ donor cards and what it means when you fill one out and what it means after you die, or even what it means when you're ill. Now, for over 40 years, there's been a lot of controversy around the term brain death or brain dead. Our next guests believe that the term was invented for the sole purpose of organ transplantation, also for living human medical experimentation, and a means in which measures to sustain life could be legally taken away. Okay? In 1999, Bernice Jones, who's going to join us in a second, her son Brandon was in a very serious accident. Now, although he was showing signs of life, his heart was beating, he was breathing on his own, the doctors went ahead and removed his organs because he had an organ donor card. Bernice was horrified by this. She'll tell us about this in a second. And we're also joined by Dr. Paul Byrne today. Paul is a board-certified neonatologist and paediatrician, and he's the president of Life Guardian Foundation. We're going to tweet out links to Life Guardian Foundation. Now, Dr. Paul Byrne and Bernice Jones are working to raise awareness about the truth, the little-known truth behind organ donation. And let's welcome Paul and Bernice to the programme. Paul and Bernice, thanks so much for taking the call. How are you?
I am fine, Richie. Thank you very much for giving us the chance to participate.
Paul, you're very welcome. Bernice, welcome to the show. I hope you're well. We might have lost Bernice there momentarily. We'll try and get her back up again. Paul, this is going to be news to an awful lot of people. You know, I suppose when people fill out an organ donor card, they do so making the assumption that when, you know, it'll only be used in the event that they die suddenly. That I imagine when you sign it or when you fill it out, people think, well, if I meet an unexpected death or if I die young, I will possibly be in a position to give life or give a chance at life to somebody else. But from what your research has discovered, that's not necessarily the truth, Paul.
Well, the truth is that there are no organs that are suitable for transplantation from a cadaver. You can get tissues from a cadaver, like bone or ligaments and that kind of thing, but organs that are transplanted, like a heart or a whole liver, those organs must come from a living person, because by the time someone is a cadaver, they are not suitable for transplantation. They are so damaged they can't be transplanted. And so the most important thing about all of this is to get people to realize that they are kept from getting any information. They are asked, do you wish to be an organ donor? And they have some mental presumption like that will happen after they're dead, but they are not informed that every time a heart is transplanted, it's a beating heart that's cut out of a living person, and in the process, the person is killed. And so people need to realize this, and it's not new. I participated in a documentary by the BBC in about 1980, and the title of it was, Are the Donors Really Dead? And the truth of the matter is the donors cannot be dead. The donors must be alive. Every organ that's transplanted comes from a living person. And the source of the organs are people who are in an accident, one kind or another, or the source that's getting to be so prominent these days are people who overdose on drugs, and they get their organs, and of course the drugs depress the the brain from functioning, and they're not given a chance to get well or to get treatment because if they have signed an organ donor card, then everything is in place to get their organs. And if someone hasn't signed an organ donor card, everything is in place to get their organs anyway. It's just they get the permission from some relative or a hospital administrator or coroner or somebody like that. But the whole system is set up to get organs if you are, especially if you're less than 30 years of age and unconscious. There's a good chance they're going to get your organs unless you have someone who will stand up for you, and even then it's very difficult. So it's important that that your listeners get informed about these things and realize that to be an organ donor, you must be alive. When you're a cadaver, your organs are no good for transplantation.
Now, what I've been doing some research on this today, and I came across an act that was passed in the United States in 1981, I believe. I think it's the Uniform Determination of Death Act. Now, what I didn't realise, Paul, is how controversial that was. It basically dealt with the two ways, I think, of judging, I suppose, whether life has left the body, whether life has expired. And it was in this Uniform Determination of Death Act that brain death was introduced. Now, if I make any mistakes here, I'm trusting that you'll jump in and tell me I've made a mistake. Brain death is described, isn't it, as the irreversible loss of brain function, the inability of the brain, I suppose, to sustain life within the body. Now, you're a doctor, Paul. To me, that would have always made sense. You know, if the brain is absolutely dead, there was a time when I would have quite happily said, all right, I can understand why somebody would switch off life support there. The brain is dead. That's what we would think, lay people. Why are we wrong, Paul?
Well, first of all, so far as the word irreversible is concerned, that's one of those words that you can only know by the opposite. So that every time a brain function starts up again, then it was no longer irreversible. You see, irreversible is something that a doctor cannot observe. A doctor can observe an absence of the functioning of the brain, but an absence of the functioning doesn't even mean that the function is gone, much less that the brain is destroyed or the person is dead. And so what happens is that they ordinary folks are not trained or disciplined to think their way through these things, and the proponents of these objectives, which is to get their organs, were able to move these things along. And actually, that was one of the reasons for the BBC documentary in 1980, is because the British criteria do not require observation of brain waves. It's just not part of the criteria. And in the United States at that time, it was thought that it was part of the criteria, when in fact it's not an absolute requirement of the criteria. And so observing electrical activity from the brain, or observing the absence of electrical activity from the brain, is not required in the criteria in Great Britain, and it's not required in the United States either. And the important thing is that it isn't that someone is dead when their brain isn't functioning. It means that their brain is quiet, and oftentimes if they get proper treatment, then the brain has a chance to recover. But of course, if someone has already cut out their beating heart, they never recover. Yes, you're right in terms of the laws that were passed to make these things happen. And you mentioned that there's two ways in the Uniform Determination of Death Act. One has to do with the absence of the brain function, and it uses very strong words like irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brainstem. But then the next part is that determination is made in accord with accepted medical standards. Well, accepted medical standards includes the fact that there were 30 different standards published in the first 10 years that brain death was out there between 1968 and 78. There were 30 different standards published, and many more since then. So the person can be declared dead by one set of standards, but alive by another. And of course, as everyone knows, when you go to the wake at the funeral home, that's a cadaver, and there's not different standards for that. A cadaver's a cadaver. And a living person is a living person. You're a living person. I'm a living person. Bernice is, and we are not cadavers. And when someone's brain isn't functioning, but their heart is beating with circulation and respiration, even if the respiration is supported by a ventilator, that doesn't mean that someone is dead. That someone is alive. And then what doctors and nurses have a chance to do is to protect and preserve the life of that unconscious person, but the system is set up to get their organs.
So just to qualify, Paul,
out there to get their organs.
I have a lot of sympathy with this. I have a lot of sympathy with your point of view on this. Now, you're a big guy, Paul, in terms of you're a smart guy, you're a qualified man. You will expect that we've been contacted by people who dismiss you and dismiss Bernice and say, oh, this is the Christians, this is the Christian thing again, it's all about religious belief. We might talk about that a bit later on, and you'll understand that, those criticisms, you'll expect to have those criticisms thrown at you, and we are getting some people saying that. But I'm going to put my cards on the table right away. I have a lot of sympathy with your point of view. And what you're saying is this act came in 1980, effectively, in layman's terms, to make it much easier to declare somebody dead, to harvest their organs, and ultimately, Paul, the transportation and the transplantation of organs is a multi-million dollar industry today. Now, before you come back on that, Bernice briefly dropped out on us. I'm going to try and get her back on. We might hear her phone ringing. This is live radio, folks. I apologise for this, but we lost Bernice just as we were saying hello there. And she's got a very important story to tell. I want to hear it. So let's hope we can reconnect with her. She's there. Line. Bernice, welcome.
On the phone.
Welcome back. How are you?
Good.
Sorry about the technical glitch a bit earlier on. Welcome to the programme, by the way. We've got Bernice Jones on. You've just been listening to Dr. Paul Byrne. Paul is obviously going to stay with us and contribute more to this. Bernice, tell us what happened to your son Brandon, and because this is obviously your entry into this area, this field of research, this campaign group. What happened to Brandon that got you alarmed about this? Tell our listeners.
Well, first I'll tell it as our family experienced it, because it's twofold. Brandon was playing with a gun, shot himself in the head. 911 was immediately called. The EMTs arrived within 6 minutes, and the ambulance would show up after 20 minutes. Everything was very slow. Brandon had already been taken out into the front yard, awaiting the ambulance. So it was my intent just to get Brandon to the hospital as soon as possible. We finally made it to the hospital, and he was taken immediately into ER. Our family gathered, and we waited for the physician to come out and speak to us, and finally he did. His first words were there was no hope for our son. He had been so severely injured that he was brain dead. He couldn't breathe on his own. He said that he was on a breathing machine, a machine that was doing the breathing for him. And he told us that, in his opinion, he couldn't be salvaged. So what he was telling us, too, that he said, and I have to reiterate this, that there was nothing that could be done for him. Well, that's when my husband stood up and said, you do everything you can to save our son's life. So the physician didn't want to. He said he would take him in to surgery more for our benefit than for our son's. He said it wasn't going to do any good.
Did he say that, Bernice? Did he say, I'm going to do it, but I'm only doing it for you and your husband. It's not going to do any good. He actually said that, did he?
Yes, he did. He said that there was no hope.
Wow.
And anyway, at this time, a woman emerged, and she was in a blue suit. She was never formally introduced to us. We were just told that she would take us to a place where we'd wait for our son as he had surgery. So we followed her outside and into a side door into the hospital, down a long corridor. We were taken to a room, and we waited. Every place that we went, this woman was with us, and she was there when we prayed, and that's all we could do was just pray. After what seemed to be an eternity, and we were so completely, I can say literally, out of our minds with terror, the doctor walks in and tells us that there is absolutely no hope. He said there's nothing that could be done. He told us to go in and say our goodbyes to Brandon, that he was going to surely die. Our family went back in, and I don't know how, when I look back at this, I don't even know how I lived through seeing Brandon. I can remember saying out loud, "Oh, Brandon, what have they done to you?" His head was swelled, and his eyes were black and blue. We prayed over him. I'm trying to accept the fact that my son is not going to live, and it's not working. We were asked to leave the room, that there was going to be a test performed. Well, we were in such a state of shock, so traumatized, we didn't even ask.
You didn't ask, yeah.
About this test.
Okay.
No, we didn't ask about. We were supposed to be trusting. This was our hope for Brandon. This hospital was supposed to be his hope. And the doctor came back in and said, "I'm sorry, but your son is dead. It's time for you to go home now." The woman in the blue suit, who had walked up and down the hall with us, had been in the room with us, was then introduced as the OPO, organ procurement agent, and she would like to talk to us about donation, organ donation. I was so upset with that. I was so infuriated. My family had just been told our son was dead. And this woman is an intrusion. My family is crying, choking. I mean, the worst time in our life. And regretfully, I stomped out of the room. And my husband and my older son signed papers under severe pressure. My mother told me afterwards that she had told my son and my husband to not sign anything unless you speak to his mother. And that woman glared at her. But this is the way it is, high pressure. Now I'm going to go back and tell you what we discovered. When Brandon was in the hospital, in the ambulance en route, he regained consciousness. It is written that he used his left arm using purposeful movement. They tried to intubate him, and they gave him a paralyzing drug, and that didn't work.
They tried to paralyze him, Bernie. This is absolutely astonishing. First of all,
well, you don't paralyze someone that is limp and unconscious, but you do have to paralyze someone who is going to resist being intubated. So Brandon was conscious
and aware of what was going on. Yeah.
When he was brought to the hospital, he was conscious. He was using. He was responding to pain. He was breathing on his own. He was through the whole ordeal. He was given repeated doses of paralyzing drugs. And it was all a lie.
Bernice,
everything was a lie.
Can I just ask you to clarify? First of all, I genuinely mean it, that I'm dreadfully sorry for you and for any parent that has to go through that. I really mean that. I can't imagine anything worse. I don't think there is anything worse for a parent. And fair, absolute credit to you, to the courage that you show in being able to talk about it, because it's not that long ago, and I'm sure you'll never come to terms with it. Thanks for doing that. How did you find out about him coming to try to sit up and try to move in the ambulance, and was resisting the intubator and was in pain, showing signs that he was aware of what was going on? When did you find out that? How did you find that out?
Well, first of all, I didn't want to live. I had just lost my son.
Yeah.
I wasn't doing well at all. And I prayed continually. But it was the day that he was supposed to have been dead that I clearly heard God's voice. Your son is alive. And I do not care if nobody believes that. That's between God and I.
Yeah.
But my husband had to restrain me. I wanted to go to the hospital. And had we, we would have found Brandon alive. You see, after Brandon was declared legally dead, after giving him 2 suffocation procedures, which is the apnea test, he was declared dead, and that was a legal process only. He wasn't dead. It was 19 hours later, the following day, that Brandon had to be given both an anesthetic and a paralyzing drug before they began his living dissection, which took over 4 hours to do.
Bernice, they told you and your husband and Brandon's grandmother that Brandon had died, but he hadn't died. He wasn't dead when they told you he had died, right?
This is standard. This is what they do. Brain death is a legal fiction.
Yeah.
It has absolutely nothing to do with truth in medical science. It has perversed medical science. It has perversed theology. And I've said this before. These are supposed to be physicians who study only, that which is for life, biology and physiology. They wouldn't be working with, they're not pathologists, they wouldn't be working with the dead. But this whole lie had to be contrived because after 100 years of living human medical experimentation, it was discovered that there could not be organs taken from the dead and transplanted. It didn't work. Then they made the discovery that if they took them from the living, it did indeed work. And it's a multi-billion-dollar business.
Bernice, let's bring Paul back in on this. And of course, Bernice, you jump in anytime you want. We've also got Dr. Paul Byrne on. Paul's a neonatologist. He's also a paediatrician. He's certified. He's a doctor. Paul, from a clinician's point of view, what do you think when you learned that in the ambulance, Brandon was aware and was conscious of what was going on, was resisting the intubator, was moving his leg and trying to sit up? What does that say to you? What does that mean? Why is that very important to his case and to Bernice's story?
It's very important because Brandon was alive And when they were trying to intubate him, he resisted. They gave him tranquilizers, Valium. They gave him paralyzing agents. Paralyzing agents make him so he can't move, doesn't anesthetize him. And they required these things. They tried multiple times to intubate him, but he was resisting so much, and they really didn't get him intubated until they got to the hospital. But then they required even more paralyzing agents at the hospital, and all of this is so shameful. I mean, I'm a doctor and have been at the forefront in making advances in neonatology and treatments of patients, and there are many things happening in medicine that are great and good for many patients, but in this aspect, the doctors have decided to overlook the fact that someone has a beating heart and circulation, and even resist things because things are happening to them, and they pretend that those patients are dead. Bernice's family was sent home at 11 o'clock at night under the pretense that Brandon was dead, when in fact Brandon was very much alive, and Brandon was there at the hospital from 11 o'clock at night by himself with no family until 5 o'clock the next afternoon, when they first took his organs. During that time, he continued to get treatment, perhaps even better treatment than he got one before that, to keep his organs in good shape. And niece was wanting to go back to the hospital. Something inside of her that was telling her that her son was still there and alive and wanted to go back and be with him. Yet Brandon was there by himself.
Paul, can I ask another question? This is so this is on my mind as I listen to Bernice and as I'm listening to you. I've seen a lot of medical dramas on television, and like most lay people, that's all I've ever been exposed to. So I'm going to suggest here, and shoot me down if I'm wrong, but if Brandon was showing signs of consciousness and awareness, and he was resisting the intubator, wouldn't it have been better to stabilise him and to help reduce any swelling on his brain by maybe putting him into a medically induced coma, so that they can have a good look later on and stabilise him to assess the damage? Is that maybe what should have happened?
Absolutely. And see, and actually the ordinary folks expect that that's going to happen.
Yeah.
But it doesn't happen because the force that's moving these things along is making money. And Brandon was worth between $1 and $5 million to the transplant industry, and so in the United States in 2014 there was $24 billion that were spent on organ transplantation, and so it's a big business.
Paul, sorry again to interrupt, and Bernice can jump in again in a second. Forgive me for the interruptions, but time is flying by here. Tell me, who gets that money? I mean, I've looked at the figures today in the time that I could research it, and your figures are right. These are astronomical amounts of money, and I'm not going to be insensitive now, and I'm not going to insult the memory of young dead boys and girls and talk about families getting money. I'm not going to say that, because the families don't care about money. They want their sons and daughters back. But Paul, who gets that money? That's massive amounts of money. Who gets it? Who receives it?
Well, doctors, hospitals are the main recipients, and then all the other people that are involved with this, the organ transplant coordinators and everybody else that's involved, not the family. And the laws are set up so that, at least in the United States, so you can't sell organs, but it's also set up that the organ transplant industry can have all of this money coming into their system, and the doctors and people who run hospitals, hospital administrators, and the like. They make tremendous amounts of money out of all of this, and see, the other part of it is that they can make money by taking the organs. If someone continues to live, then they have to spend money to treat them. So you see, the way to make the money in the industry is to get the organs, and then somebody who needs treatment, get them out of the way so you don't waste money on them. And money is an important part of it, but the most important part of it is that Brandon had an accident, and with proper treatment, there's a good chance that Brandon would still be alive. His injury to his brain was serious, like all had brain injuries, but it was the kind of brain injury that people get over, but they have to get treatment. But they saw him as a 16-year-old, healthy, strong organ donor, and his organs were worth millions. And Bernice and her family had no idea of what was going on, just like most of the other people that families have troubles. They have no ideas. Bernice didn't find out these things about the medications and other things that were given to Brandon until after they got a hold of the hospital records and the like. And it's the system is set up that you really can't, Bernice and her family really can't do anything legally because lawyers won't take the case.
That was my next question, Paul. And just to remind our listeners, Dr. Paul Byrne is on the line, and we've also got Bernice. Look, folks, massive amount of tweets coming in on this. I won't have time to read out all these tweets. Go to Richie Allen Show on Twitter to read what people are saying. Bernice Jones is on the line too. Bernice's son, Brandon, was in a serious accident with a gun back in 1999. Bernice, you know, I'm not trying to be in any way flippant at all. This sounds like the script of, or the theme of a book by somebody like Robin Cook. It's absolutely staggering, this, you know. It really is, and it's the first time any of our listeners have ever heard anything like this at all. And of course, my next question, and Paul just touched on it there, was did you try and seek any redress with the hospital? Did you try and get any answers from the hospital? What was it like when you started asking questions? Because you're obviously a very smart, very articulate woman. You're motivated, you're passionate. So you begin asking questions. Did you get stonewalled, Bernice? Were doors slammed in your face? How did it work when you began to say, what happened to my son?
It's legal. It is a fallacy. It is a legal fiction. There is nothing, absolutely nothing about what happened to our son in which we experienced that was the truth. But they are legally held unaccountable. These people can kill the living, breathing, heart-beating, blood-circulating individual. They can speak out the word brain dead. They can put on the ventilator, give them much oxygen, fill up their lungs with oxygen, and expect them to exhale. If they can't breathe, that's the only indicator. Okay, we're going to declare them dead now. What they do is it's a suffocation. I call it a medical suffocation. And it is what I compare it as waterboarding, a type of torture. That is the legal means in which they can declare somebody brain dead. And it starts with when the doctor first came out and said to us, your son is brain dead. It has no meaning. In medicine, it has absolutely, really no meaning. A person that has a beating heart and they're able to have the blood gas exchange and the nutrients delivered and the intestinal tract is working, and please, I'm not that stupid. And that is the way I approached it. I did not want revenge. I asked questions. And, sadly enough, it is legal. It is legal. And all involved have impunity.
They can't be touched.
And
They can't be touched. Folks, go to lifeguardianfoundation.org. Forgive me, Bernice, but if I don't do that, you'd rightly have a go at me later on. Go to lifeguardianfoundation.org. Bernice Jones is on the line. What Bernice has described and has told us that happened to her son Brandon is absolutely sickening. It is, because, Paul, come back in on this. The doctor didn't have any time whatsoever, or couldn't have performed the tests required to say that there was zero brain function in Brandon. When Bernice and her husband and the family were told that doctor really couldn't have determined that. Is it fair to say that?
Oh, it's impossible for those kind of determinations to be made. But the serious thing about it is Bernice mentioned that they did this procedure called the apnea test, and everyone that's listening should know, do not allow that procedure to be done. What they do with the apnea test is the patient who's on the ventilator, they take the ventilator away for 10 minutes. They suffocate them for 10 minutes. The carbon dioxide goes up. That makes the brain swell and makes them get worse. And they're without breath for 10 minutes. You and I take a breath every 2-3 seconds. We take a breath, and yet they take them off the ventilator, not for a half a minute or for a minute, but for 10 minutes. They suffocated Brandon twice, which made his brain swell worse. And they did it twice to him, and they do it to these patients. And these kind of things are going on, and it doesn't mean anything to them to suffocate the patient. When I've taken care of patients on ventilators, we're very careful that if we do have to take them off to suction them or something quickly, we get them back on a matter of seconds off. But yet they take them off for 10 minutes. It's absolutely terrible. Everybody must learn to say no to organ donation. Completely no. They have to say no to the apnea test and that procedure of the apnea test. And then the thing about the records, Richie, I have even gone as far as be at the bedside with the patient who's unconscious and on a ventilator, with the husband of the patient and with the lawyer there, and they still won't give us any records. That they protect the records, and even after the things go on, you still can't get records. One of the patients, it's more than a year, and still we don't have the results of the autopsy of the patient because they won't allow the records to get out. These things are all going on in a way that, as Bernice said, it's all legal to do these things. Brain death is not death. Brain death is not fake death. A word that I came across recently, it's a mendacity. That is something that's thought to be true, but that it's false, and that's what brain death is. Brandon, Bernice's son, had a serious injury, but he was not dead until they cut his organs out the next day, and he was left there at the hospital by himself, without his mother, without his father, without his brother, without his sister, and it's just absolutely awful what's happening to these patients. And
Paul, you're basically saying, I mean, this is staggering stuff. You're a doctor to be saying this. What you're actually saying is they murdered Brandon. I mean, there's no other, you can't put any other point on, not to put too fine a point on it. They took his life, basically.
Yes.
It is legalized medical homicide. Yes. That's what I call it.
Now, look, I don't want to be...
what it is.
Sorry, Bernice, I don't want to be, no pun intended, the devil's advocate, right? I don't want to, for the sake of doing it. But I mentioned to Paul earlier on, Bernice, when we had some difficulty getting you on, and I'm glad we were able to get you on. I mentioned that, we have listeners, and they might be agnostic, they might not have any faith, and they have been saying, one listener said, I've left explicit instructions that I not be resuscitated. We've had people saying things like, oh, this is what you would expect from fundamentalist Christians, and I expect you get that sort of thing thrown at you all the time. It's not coming from me, because I've got very, very serious questions and grave reservations about euthanasia and about these issues, even though I am agnostic in my own life, in my own faith. But we will have doctors listening to this, and they'll say, I completely disagree with Bernice and Paul. I've seen what great benefits organ donation can bring. I've seen lives changed. I've seen people given heart transplants that have given them a new lease of life. People have been taken out of car wrecks, and they've been mangled, and they've there's very little left of them, but we got their heart, or we got their lungs, and we gave somebody a new life. And Paul, that there will be people listening to this, this, Bernice, and they will have been brought up with this narrative. They will believe that organ transplantation is a wonderful thing. It shows man's ingenuity at its absolute finest. We're brilliant that we can do these things. And you're telling them a story tonight, and it's vital that this story be told, but it'll shake them to their foundations, and they will say, this can't be right. Organ donation is a good thing. What do you say to that, both of you?
Well, of course, when we see someone who has received an organ, and they're doing well, we're happy with that. At least that's the impression that we get. But one has to realize that if it's a heart, it had to be a beating heart that was cut out with someone. So someone had to be killed. Well, that's a basic thing of human beings, is that we don't kill other human beings. We don't harm other human beings. And yet, in order to get any organ for transplantation, the one they take the organ from is killed and is certainly harmed and killed the majority of times. And so we have to be able to think beyond the immediate. And while, yes, we can be happy that someone is alive, but but we are not allowed and should not be allowed to kill someone to get their organs. And most of the people, if they knew what was going on, I suspect most of the people would be right where Bernice and I are. We don't want anything bad to happen to anybody, but once they have some serious thing wrong with them, then the idea and what should be is to protect and preserve their life. But it's not to take advantage of the unconscious, defenseless person and cut their organs out and give them to someone else who has a lobby that's stronger than the unconscious and defenseless person.
Bernice, this when you talk to people about this, it shocks people, doesn't it? People are not aware of the procedures that these hospitals and these doctors use to, I hate to say, harvest organs. People are just not aware of it. I wasn't aware of it. I wasn't. I mean, I've got a big issue with euthanasia and things like the Liverpool Care pathway and euthanasia being on the agenda, and it's coming back on the agenda, and I'm terrified of that because I think palliative care and medicine has never been better, and alternative medicine as well. It's never been better to keep people comfortable and to keep them stable while we look to help them. I think euthanasia is terrible. But Bernice, I knew nothing about this. I imagine when you tell your story, and it's horrendous to hear about what happened to Brandon and your pain and the pain of your family, it must shock people, Bernice, to their very boots. They must just be completely blown away by this information.
They are. I mean, you have to understand that I was believing that the hospital was my son's refuge. This is where I was to get my son to have help. I had absolutely no idea that things like that were going on behind closed doors. I had no idea. But the bottom line is that this isn't just about my son. The reason why I'm speaking out is because anybody who becomes an organ donor, anybody who's had their beating heart taken out, such as my son, and his liver taken out, these are people who are killed for their organs. Could they have survived? In Japan, they don't believe in brain death. And the people survive, over 70% of them. So is it a cultural? I think it's cultural too. But here in America, there are no ands, ifs, or about it. What they can do, they don't need even somebody with a head injury anymore. They can perform they can say that the person is going to die, that they have an illness, or whatever the case may be. They can perform the apnea test. Actually, it's an apnea procedure, and declare them dead. They just say that the heart quit beating, in which it cannot. During that apnea test, Brandon's heart never quit beating. His pulse would slow, but his heart never quit beating. If it did, he would have been useless to them. Alive, 16 years old, 185-pound football player. His heart was very valuable. And that's what it's all about. It's all about money.
You know what, Bernice?
I want everybody to understand that the situations that can bring people into the hospital may differ.
Yeah.
The injuries may be different. But all organ donors go through the same thing as Brandon did.
And
I also want to make sure that everybody knows that it is in medical journals, throughout medical journals, about the pain that is inflicted on these organ donors when they begin those living dissections. And there's much literature about this. This is so evil. And that's the only thing I can call it, is it's evil.
It's why I made the Robin Cook analogy earlier on. It wasn't to be funny. You know, it reminds me of books like Coma and other books written. It's staggering. Paul, finally, and we've only got about 90 seconds left, and I'm going to mention again, lifeguardianfoundation.org. These issues affect you in the UK, in the Republic of Ireland, in Spain and France and Germany, as much as they affect our listeners in the United States. Paul, this is going on then in this country. I'm speaking to you from Manchester in the northwest of the United Kingdom. They're following the same procedures here. Am I right?
I didn't quite catch the
Sorry, Paul. Yeah, we might have just dropped out momentarily. Yeah, I was just asking you to confirm that the horrible procedures described by both you and Bernice tonight, in order to harvest organs, those procedures would be followed here in this country, in Ireland, and in Europe. I'm guessing it's the same thing, right?
Yes, it's the same everywhere. They have different sets of criteria, but they all are criteria for an absence of the functioning of the brain. But an absence of the functioning doesn't even mean that the function is gone or that the brain is destroyed, much less that the person is dead. See, it's brain death is brainwashing. You hear death in that term and you think death, but what brain death means is alive. Everybody who's called brain dead is alive. None of them are cadavers. They get to be cadavers after they get their organs taken out. Then they are a cadaver. Or they get to be a cadaver if their treatment that they need is taken away. But there's clearly a difference. All of these patients are living patients, but they want their organs, and in the process they become dead.
Bernice, thanks for sharing that period of your life with us, and of course it's not over, because for you, raising awareness and educating people about this goes on. I mean that sincerely, Bernice. It's difficult to listen to you talk about what you went through, so it must be equally far more difficult for you to talk about it. Thanks for doing that, and to you as well, Dr. Paul Byrne. It's lifeguardianfoundation.org, folks. Educate yourselves about brain death, what brain death is, and think very long and hard before you sign one of those forms and get one of those organ donor cards. Know as much as you can about it. Thanks to both of you for giving us your time today. I really mean that. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
For having us.
It was an honour. It really was. Dr. Paul Byrne, there, a paediatrician and neonatologist, and you heard Bernice Jones talking about her 16-year-old son Brandon and the awful experience he went through, and they went through, the family, when he was injured in that shooting accident. Amazing stuff, really, isn't it? And a number of you have been in touch to say that you really didn't understand any of this, and in that, yet again, you and I are brother and sister. I didn't either. You know, I didn't. I would have assumed that, you know, I didn't understand the term brain death. I obviously had to do some research today to find out that the term was first introduced in the Uniform Determination of Death Act in the US in 1980, because basically they wanted to describe loss of brain function. And what Dr. Paul Byrne has told us there, and what Bernice told us, stacks up, at least as far as the research I could do today. It seems that it was the sole purpose of introducing that description, that diagnosis, that brain death, was all about the harvesting of organs, which is a multi-billion-dollar a year industry. And I wasn't being insensitive, and I didn't want to say earlier on, you know, the families don't see a penny of the money. I didn't want it to sound like that, so I stopped myself. But you have families, you know, and they don't know what's going on, and organs are taken from their son or daughter or wife or husband. And Paul is right. The hospitals make millions out of it. Millions. Has any hospital ever thought, I wonder how Brandon's family are doing financially, I wonder, are they struggling with funeral costs maybe? I wonder, do they need a few bob, like, you know what I mean? Now, of course, you speak to anybody whose son has died and you say, you know, we're going to give you some money. You know, his kidneys or his lungs or her heart has helped somebody live, and, you know, we made a lot of money out of that. Of course, the family don't want money. They're going to be horrified by it. I'm not saying that. It's a weird one, this. But I think you understand where I'm coming from.